Hello, dear viewers, and welcome back. And today, what I wanted to do was upload something a bit different and take a break from all the Death Battle videos just for a little bit, because I talk a lot about Death Battle and versus matchups in general. And one thing I really just have been wanting to talk about, because I talk about this all the time, is I always get a lot of crap for my takes on what I consider to be good and bad death battles. And while I did make a video years back explaining what makes a good versus matchup and the steps that you can take to ensure that your versus matchup is solid and not just a lazy, thoughtless mirror matchup, but I feel that looking back at it, that video was not as well made as I thought it could have been. Though I still stand by some of my points, I feel I didn't make some of my points clear enough. And I want to talk about that a little bit more here, so I don't want to waste any more time. So when it comes to matchups, I usually highlight 3 or 4 very simple steps, because contrary to what some people believe, some people think that I have these ridiculously high standards of, oh, your standards for a good matchup are impossible to meet, but I actually break it down to 3 or 4 very simple factors. The first one being compatibility. As I explained in my other video, a good versus matchup is like a house. Without a good foundation, everything is going to crumble. And if the compatibility of your matchup sucks, if you take 2 characters where one has a clear disadvantage against the others, then it ruins the tension, it doesn't make the fight fun, and it doesn't make the fight believable. An easy, simple example of this that I usually like to go to is Natsu versus Ace, which was not only a lazy mirror matchup, but a hilariously bad one because of the fact that, let's take a guy whose superpower is that he can turn into fire, and then have him fight the guy whose ability is literally to eat fire. What sense does that make? And it gets even more worse with other matchups that I see, like, don't get me started on the innumerable matchups I see involving Homelander, even though more times than not, the characters that they always put Homelander against would beat the living crap out of him, because contrary to popular belief, Homelander is not that powerful. But I digress. You got to get your compatibility right. You got to check to make sure they're at least on some kind of even playing field. They don't have to be the exact same strength, but you got to make sure that if these 2 characters fight each other, it's at least on some level believable. Like, you wouldn't take Dora the Explorer and put her up against Goku. That would make no sense. You wouldn't take a character from DOA and have her fight frickin' Saber from the Fate franchise, because that just wouldn't end very well. And it always drives me nuts when I see people match up characters against each other that have an obvious outcome, because it ruins the surprise. The whole point of a versus matchup is the question of, well, who will win? Well, when you go in knowing, well, of course, this character wins, then at that point, you're just coming at it from the perspective of, oh, well, I'll get to possibly see some pretty animation later down the line, and if that's all you're really watching it for, you might as well just like look up fan animations or cinematics of fictional characters fighting each other. You would get the same effect. So one thing I always emphasize is get compatibility right. And that doesn't necessarily mean just in terms of like speed, strength, durability, and whatnot, because there's also the whole hack power thing. Like, in the case of, say, Grimmy from the Bleach series, you're dealing with a character who quite literally has the power of imagination itself. And most characters would have a hard time trying to deal with such a character, because he can literally just imagine you not having any powers or just never existing at all, and it will become so. Anything he imagines becomes so. You wouldn't take somebody like Grimmy and put him up against somebody like Vegeta, because that is an example of, yes, Vegeta may have the greater strength, speed, durability, but it won't matter if Grimmy can literally just imagine Vegeta dead, and it will happen. So you gotta always look at the compatibility, not just in terms of speed, strength, durability, but also you gotta make sure that the hack powers don't cause some kind of vast disparity. And that can include other hack abilities like, for example, you think of somebody like Rogue from the Marvel series, where her whole thing is she can absorb your power and stack it onto her own. That could obviously be problematic when you're dealing with characters like, I don't know, Wonder Woman, Superman, or characters that just have freakish amounts of strength. Like if you put somebody like Kenpachi up against somebody like Rogue, and I mean in terms of like the whole like absorbing power and then using it to amplify your own, like that can be a bit of an unfair advantage. At the very least, if you're gonna do that, make sure they have some way to counter it, or make sure it's at least got some kind of fair limit. So again, compatibility is always the first thing I emphasize. Now here's something I don't always elaborate on enough. Ask yourself this, the plot. Why are your two characters fighting? I used to say that you gotta deal with compatibility and then connections, but I would actually argue that you need to come up with at least some kind of decent, defined reason for why they're fighting. Even Death Battle can occasionally get this right when they want to, but when they don't get it right, it's just stupid, like Yang walking up into Tifa's bar to murder her for no reason that is ever explained. Why is she there? Why does she want to kill Tifa? Why does she even know who the heck Tifa is? Never explained. Or in the case of Mikasa versus Blake, they literally just fight because Mikasa told Blake to get out of a dangerous area. And that somehow leads to them fighting. When you do stuff like that, it just makes the characters look stupid. If the characters start a fight for a dumb reason or for no reason at all, it just makes the characters look dumb and or petty. Now, if you have a character like Joker starting a fight with Sweet Tooth over Joker stealing his ice cream cone, yeah, you can maybe get away with that, possibly, but even then, it's still kind of lame. A perfect example of this, and I will use Death Battle as an example, to show that there are examples even within Death Battle. So people don't think like, oh, well, Death Battle doesn't do it. Sam Fisher versus Solid Snake. That's always my go-to as an example of a pretty much perfect death battle. And the question of why are they fighting is very simple. You don't need to create some kind of like grand, elaborate plot or story. You just need to get some kind of a reason for why they're there and why they're fighting each other. In the case of Solid Snake versus Sam Fisher, what did Death Battle write? Well, Solid Snake and Sam Fisher are both tasked with collecting some intel. Sam Fisher gets there first, Solid Snake shows up, and then they start fighting over the intel. Boom. That's all you need. It's a simple enough reason for why they're there. It's a simple, valid enough reason for why they're fighting. And those little bits of story and plot help make the actual fight more engaging rather than two characters showing up in an area for no defined reason whatsoever and just beating the crap out of each other because reasons. Even action movies, even the dumbest action movies on planet Earth have some kind of plot or reason as to why the action is happening. Even if you want to look to like John Wick, why is everything in John Wick happening? Because a mob boss's son screwed up and killed the wrong guy's dog, and now he's out for revenge. Simple. It's not really all that complicated. It doesn't need to be all that complicated as long as it's a reasonable enough explanation for why these characters are fighting each other, because otherwise it's just meaningless violence at that point. So make sure you come up with some kind of decent plot. Whenever I come up with versus matchup ideas for Blood Royale, I always ask myself, what kind of story could I tell? What would be the reason for why these two characters are fighting? And here's an example. So when I made my video idea for Freddy Krueger versus Hellgirl, and I discussed this with a good friend of mine, of the plot I came up with in my mind for Freddy Krueger versus Hellgirl is that Freddy Krueger has been terrorizing the children on Elm Street, and one of the final survivors of Freddy's rampage contacts the Hellgirl correspondents in a last-ditch effort to put an end to Freddy Krueger once and for all. Hellgirl shows up, does her thing, gives the straw doll. This final survivor goes to sleep, gets chased by Freddy for a brief moment, and then summons Hellgirl to fight Freddy Krueger, and boom, there's your plot to Hellgirl versus Freddy Krueger. Again, it's simple. That's all you really need. Have some kind of plot or reason as to why your two characters are fighting. It doesn't have to be Lord of the Rings. It just has to be believable. I mean, I often make this comparison. A bad versus matchup is like bad wrestling. Contrary to popular belief, people don't watch wrestling for the wrestling, because whenever you try to get a wrestling show that tries to focus only on the wrestling and not telling a story with any characters, it ends up killing the ratings. So, like a good wrestling show, you need story and characters and a reason for why people are wrestling. The wrestling is just the means by which the story is told. Something like Death Battle is no different. The fighting, the animation, is just the means by which you are telling your story of why these two characters are fighting. And given that we're all fans who have probably imagined all kinds of different fan fictions when it comes to watching our favorite characters kill each other, why would you not want to come up with some like cool badass plot for why the two characters are fighting? Why would you want to say like, oh, well, they just walk into a building and just fight each other? Like, doesn't that sound boring? Don't you want to make things exciting and big? Now, you don't always have to make every death battle into some big epic thing. I'm not saying it always has to be that way. You have to tailor your plot to make sure that it makes sense for those characters. Like, yeah, maybe with something like Goku versus Superman, you can have something like big and bold, but with something like a smaller scale, like Sam Fisher versus Solid Snake, you can have it be something as simple as them fighting over a piece of intel, or in the case of, what was it, Nightwing versus Daredevil, they were fighting over some kind of briefcase. Not the greatest thing in the world, but at least it was something. So that would be step number 2. Make sure you have some kind of plot and story for why your two characters are fighting. Then, getting to number 3, which I talk about and get into fights with people in the versus community all the frickin' time about connections. Now, here's what I would argue. Connections and similarities are not the same thing, because there's always this misconception where people are like, oh, well, these two characters, they have the same power, they have the same character, they have the same personality, they have the same background, so have them fight. Well, I disagree with that, because all it just creates is a lazy mirror matchup, and it makes things less interesting as a result. Now, some similarities here and there can be acceptable. It just depends on what the similarity is. Now, for example, in the case of Hellgirl versus Freddy Krueger, yes, they are both demons, and they do have theming around vengeance. Now, that connection of vengeance is something that can pull them together. I don't just sit here and say like, oh, well, they're both demons that were burned by fire and then came back as vengeful spirits or demons of some kind, so have them fight, because that's just kind of lame. Or you wouldn't sit here and say like, oh, well, we should have Zuko fight Genryusai Yamamoto because they both wield fire. Like, that's boring. Have a connection that actually connects the characters and the universe, not some lame surface level similarity. And here's another thing I will say. The connection and similarity that you are trying to establish with your characters should be something that connects to the actual fight itself. This is the problem with surface level connections. Yeah, on some level, I can understand why having similar powers can affect the fight. I'll throw you that bone. Depending on the situation, that can sometimes be okay, but it really depends. But if you have a similarity that is, oh, well, they wear the same color, as much as that is an extreme example, but I have seen people say that, well, these characters wear the same color, or they have the same color hair, or they have the same background or whatever. Okay, how does that affect the fight? Your connections should connect the characters and actually be something that will affect the actual fight itself. Otherwise, what's the point? I mean, it's almost the equivalent of saying, well, these characters should fight because they're both women. I mean, it's boring. And yes, if you are finding some of these examples to be like boring and simplified, well, that's kind of the point, don't you think? All too often, I always have to hear the same type of matchup over and over and over again. These characters have the same power. These characters both fight demons. These characters have the same exact personality, so have them fight. Here's one thing I will say. In the case of Bridget versus Astolfo, another one I have mentioned on the channel before. Originally, I did not like that fight because the original reason why people suggested that fight was, well, they're both silly femboys. Well, after doing some thinking and after some recent revelations with what's going on with the whole Bridget drama, I came to a different conclusion. The reason why Bridget versus Astolfo works to me, and the reason why something like Freddy Krueger versus Hellgirl works, is because there's something bigger going on. That's another thing I will say. Step 4 should be your fight should feel big. The idea of the characters fighting should always be bigger than the actual fight itself. Now, in the case of Bridget versus Astolfo, this one goes so much deeper than, well, they're both cute femboys or they're both silly heroes. No. What this is about is you have this whole culture war because the trannies and the traps and femboys are in a culture war with each other. Why? Hell if I could tell you. But because of this culture war, you now have this bigger idea of you have these two characters that have become mascots and icons of these two communities. So it's not just about Bridget and Astolfo fighting to see who is stronger, but also about the larger conflict between the transgender and the trap community and what these two characters represent to each community. And you also can have this theming of lies, deception, and all kinds of other stuff, because those are things that are usually discussed when it comes to the topics of both of those characters, is the concept of lies, deception, who is somebody's true self, who is actually more based, essentially, if you want to get it into slang terms. And it's similar with Freddy Krueger versus Hellgirl. Yes, they are both horror icons, but you have a horror icon from America versus a horror icon from Japan. East versus West. Similar to Goku versus Superman. I always argue that Goku versus Superman is not an iconic matchup because, oh, well, they're both basically the same character. Goku is basically just Japanese Superman. No, it's bigger than that because you have these big cultural ideas of heroes and the ideals and virtues that each hero represents to their country and to their culture. Superman represents American ideals, American heroism, in the same way that Goku does the same for Japan. And that is what makes that such a legendary matchup, to the point where even Death Battle has done Goku versus Superman, like, what, how many times now? 3 times? And I wouldn't be surprised if we end up getting it a 4th time. And I believe you have that with something like Freddy Krueger and Hellgirl, or Shiro versus Lucy, or Bridget versus Astolfo. I believe these are big matchups that will have an impact, and people will be able to get easily invested in, and will get people talking about it for potentially even years to come. Here's another example of what I'm talking about. I remember not too long ago, I was on Twitter, and I was in a Death Battle group chat, and we were suggesting different ideas, right? Well, one idea I suggested is we got on the topic of James Bond, because we were talking about Death Battle's James Bond versus John Wick episode. And I know a lot of people always say they want to see James Bond fight Jason Bourne. And if I'm being honest, I've never really found that one all that interesting. Now, the one that always stuck out to me, and it always blew my mind that this is not what we got. Like, I was surprised that Death Battle didn't do James Bond versus Jason Bourne, because with the amount of times it's been suggested, I thought for sure that's what we were going to get. And while John Wick was interesting, it was ultimately an unfair matchup because they did a composite James Bond versus John Wick, and they didn't even wait for John Wick 4 to come out, which I thought was kind of crappy, but I won't get into that. So I thought that what would have been a better matchup is Ethan Hunt from Mission Impossible versus James Bond. Think about it. Take a moment to think about it. Ethan Hunt versus James Bond. It's genius. And when I was talking about it with these people in this group chat, they agreed. They're like, holy crap, that's awesome. And they're like, damn, that matchup feels huge, like just the idea of it. And I'm like, exactly my point. You have these two legacy characters from two iconic franchises of spies and espionage. That sells itself. Why not do Ethan Hunt versus James Bond? And if you want to go off of the similarity things, Ethan Hunt has a lot more similarities than frickin' Jason Bourne does with James Bond. Like, come on, like Jason Bourne, as I understand, is basically just a glorified assassin. He's not even a spy. Now, sure, James Bond is both a spy and an assassin, but then again, so is Ethan Hunt. I think that would be a much more interesting matchup, and it's a shame that Death Battle didn't actually do that because it's a huge missed opportunity, but have no fear, because if Blood Royale becomes a thing, there's a highly likely chance I will do it. However, the point is that James Bond versus Ethan Hunt would be a far more interesting matchup. Make your matchup feel big. Sell your matchup. Don't just come up to me with a picture and say like, here's these two characters and here's who I think would win. That's boring. No, think of it like think about that you're talking to like, I don't know, an executive producer and you want to sell them a TV show. Like, hey, here's a script for this TV show or this movie that I think would be great. And all you do is just plop a script on the table and all it has is just the name of the idea, but you don't have a story, you don't have any characters, you didn't actually think of anything. How long do you think that's gonna last before that gets thrown in the garbage? No, you gotta sell people on your idea, get people excited for it. Tell me why your matchup will be good. Tell me why these characters fighting would be interesting. So, to kind of recap a little bit, here are 3 to 4 simple steps that if you apply them, you can easily come up with, at the very least, a decent versus matchup. Not every versus matchup has to be the greatest thing ever. Not every versus matchup I come up with is the greatest thing ever. But if you take more time to think about your matchups, rather than just spamming whatever is popular or throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks, take some time to actually think about, well, which character would make the most sense for this character to fight? And every once in a while, you will hit a gold mine and get a really, really cool matchup if you just take some time and be patient about it. You don't need to have 30 different Death Battle ideas. If you can come up with even just one good one, that is a win in and of itself. Like, I admit that it can take me a long time to come up with good versus matchups, but while not all of them are winners, I've come up with my fair share of dog shit, i.e. Accelerator versus Lucy, but eventually I do come up with something really, really cool, like Freddy Krueger versus Hellgirl, Shiro versus Lucy, even though that one's not 100% original. Other people have suggested that idea too, but I digress. Or other matchups that I have suggested, such as Ghost Rider versus Simon Belmont. That one I get a lot of crap for, but I think having Ghost Rider fight Simon Belmont is more interesting than just having Ghost Rider fight Spawn, because, well, they're basically the same thing. I find things like Ghost Rider versus Spawn or Ghost Rider versus Scorpion to be laughably boring. But that's just me. But this is just a video I really wanted to make to kind of just explain my stance on things like this a little bit more. Again, to recap, compatibility, plot and story, connections and similarities. Or scratch that, just stick to the connection part, because similarities won't always get you anywhere. But if you want to do both connections and similarities, fine. And then number 4 is have your matchup actually be big, have it feel big. These are my thoughts on this. And I may elaborate on this maybe in a live stream whenever I can get that back up and running, or in other future videos, because I'm always having to explain my thoughts on this, and hopefully this clears things up a little bit more. Let me know what you think. Do you think there's any points I can be missing that can be good ingredients for a versus matchup, or do you agree that my 3 to 4 steps works fine enough? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys around next time.
What have you done, anime?